What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
On the line with us is Ryan Hampton, and the book is called American Fix: Inside the Opioid Addiction Crisis and How to End It. I've got to tell you, Ryan, I've read a lot about opioids. I've moderated panels on it. I haven't had personal experience, thankfully, but I've got to say that your book really brought me into the subject in a very profoundly personal way. I could even feel the terrible energy as people were getting ready and you were going to get some pills at a pain clinic, I believe it was, in South Florida, right as the onset of Katrina was, arriving. And just the situation that people were facing. I mean, were you trying to make certain that those of us, perhaps even on the outside, could understand the personal nature of this crisis in America?
No, absolutely. I mean, thank you for having me on. Yes, I mean, I didn't, I just celebrated 4 years in recovery at the beginning of this month and on February 2nd. And on February 3rd, 2015, the day after I found recovery, I didn't wake up and say, I want to write a book about this. That first year in recovery for me was really difficult. I started losing friends, people I really, really cared about. I was very silent about my recovery, about my addiction journey. Didn't want people to know it. I was still very ashamed of what had happened. And then as my friends started to die, and I started burying some people really close to me that I loved and cared about very deeply, I just said, something's not right here. And that led me into advocacy. And then as a result of that, I ended up penning and writing and eventually publishing American Fix. That specific story you're talking about in the midst of Hurricane Katrina in South Florida, was an absolute nightmare. And I wish I knew then what I know now. I don't want anybody to read this and think of me as coming across as trying to play just this pure victim role. But at the end of the day, these doctors that were involved in these pill mills, particularly in South Florida, these pharmaceutical manufacturers and distributors and pharmacies down there, opioid-specific pharmacies, were drug dealers. They were legal drug dealers, sanctioned by the FDA and the DEA, and they were out there pushing pills. And their ultimate goal was to get America hooked. And it's interesting you lead with that question because I think a lot has come to light just in the last 2 weeks on this subject. The Attorney General of Massachusetts, the lawsuit that she had filed against Purdue Pharma was unredacted by the district court there. And we're learning more and more to how strategic Purdue was, how strategic McKinsey and Company was, one of the world public relations firms, to turbocharge the sales of OxyContin, what they knew and when they knew it. And I personally believe, and this was a part that didn't make it into the book because this is new information that's coming, but, Purdue was found criminally negligent. 3 of their executives were fined. They did escape jail time in 2007. But I think with all this new information that's coming to light, we are way above and beyond levels of criminal liability at this point. People have gone to prison for crimes way less than what the Sackler family and McKinsey in particularly committed. They had public relations campaigns to get around DEA regulation. They had public relations campaigns to counter the emotional messages of mothers who had lost their children to opioid overdoses. It's really maddening. And when I wrote the book, I wanted people to walk away with that same sense of outrage that I lived, not just while I was in my addiction, but in finding recovery. The uphill battles that we face in trying to combat this crisis.
Well, even the treatment centers, you talked about the treatment centers that really were just, really thinly veiled efforts to make money, use the expansion of Obamacare and health insurance just to make a quick buck. That those who were victimized by many of these legal companies who are now finally coming to heel for some of the things they did, were pawns in this game. And it's so sad.
No, absolutely. I mean, you make a good point. So, and then caught in the middle of that, though, are people like me. I mean, I'm one of the lucky ones. I survived. I'm alive, and I'm in recovery now. But, we have many people who don't survive it, and they don't survive it on both sides of the crisis, either while they're out there using as a result of being hooked on legally prescribed FDA-approved opioids, or as a result of being caught in the revolving door of America's failed addiction treatment industry. Addiction treatment in this country is a $35 billion per year industry. It's actually, it is more of a profitable industry than the opioid, the legal opioid industry, the pharmaceutical opioid industry.
Say that again.
So the opioid pharmaceuticals, it's about a $33 billion per year industry in the United States. The addiction treatment industry in the United States is approximately $35 billion per year and growing. And that's the amount of money, that we know about, right? And there has been a vast majority of that money that has been acquired through fraud. There have the Affordable Care Act, which was a very well-intentioned piece of legislation that I happen to personally support. It helped our community with things such as pre-existing conditions, making sure that addiction was covered under that, and mental health, so that we wouldn't lose coverage. But it also required insurance payers to pay for addiction treatment on par with other chronic health conditions, which is a positive thing. However, it didn't go far enough in some of the regulations. So what we saw were all of these rogue treatment centers post-ACA being passed in 2009 that opened up all around the country. I mean, we saw people who were in the pill mill business, folks who owned those pill mills that I talked about in that opening chapter that you referenced to during Hurricane Katrina. They closed shop from their pill mills, and then they turned right around and opened up addiction treatment centers. People who have no business doing this, and their reasoning for this was not to necessarily help people. It was to milk the system for as much money as possible. We have no gold standard for addiction treatment in the United States. It is a vastly unregulated industry. Only until recently has the government started to kind of look under the hood, see what's going on there, and what they're seeing is an absolute disaster. But kind of the silver lining on all this is that families are beginning to ask more questions when they send their loved one to a treatment facility. I think America is much more woke that treatment is being scrutinized, and they want to make sure that their family member goes to a safe, stable, and qualified place. There are a lot of good treatment centers out there, too, doing some phenomenal work. Sadly, though, we're seeing the good ones really falling by the wayside at the expense of the bad ones who are out there just to milk the system for $1. So it is a huge problem in this country. We need a full public health approach.
Ryan, how much have we really learned over the last couple of years when this crisis has really burgeoned? It has gotten a lot of exposure. There's an illegal side to it. There's a legal side to it. There's an unethical side that you bring to us. You also remind us that it's a combination of things, these pill mills, pharmacies, doctors, clinics, jails, rehab. I mean, there's a whole industry swirling around this. How many states, for example, let's assume the federal government hasn't in any large macro sense gotten their arms around all of this. What states have begun to do a good job of trying to harness this, regulate it, and then treat individuals who have succumbed to many of the temptations and all of the industry around this?
So you make a very good point. The federal government has kind of scratched the surface in terms of addressing this. Sadly, there's not enough people with lived experience, people like myself and my community who are at those tables helping these policymakers make decisions. So sadly, what we're seeing is a huge amount of money. I mean, huge in the sense we the Support Act, which was H.R. 6, which Trump just signed into law, also known as the opioids package a few weeks ago, allocated $8 billion over the next 5 years. The problem with that is that we know that we need somewhere on par of $20 billion per year like the AIDS crisis gets if we're ever going to scratch the surface at ending this. But we have seen local communities and states start to take the charge. a lot of what needs to happen, this federal government can provide funding, but the states need to spend it in the right way. The states really need to rewrite their regulations. The states need to implement programs such as Florida, which started the Florida Alliance for Recovery Residences. Florida led the way on making sure that sober living were safe places for people to go after they get out of treatment. Florida instituted the patient brokering ban, making it illegal before the federal government did just a few months ago. Arizona is leading the way with some reform. Massachusetts has done a good job. My home state of California is still very far behind the eight ball, but they are starting to write legislation that is favorable to people who are suffering from substance use disorders and looking at them as consumers, not just as dirty, quote unquote addicts who don't deserve a second chance or the same basic health care as anyone else. So states are really starting to lead the way, and it is important that states get more involved because the federal government does not and will never have the answer to ending this crisis.
What about limits on doctors? I know in the state of Connecticut, where we come from, we've put pretty severe limits on how much in the way of painkillers a doctor can prescribe. We've set up databases to make certain that people are not doctor shopping. How important is that to the entire process?
So that's kind of a double-edged sword, actually. I'm someone who ended up on heroin because I was abruptly cut off from my medication in 2008 as a result of ending up in a database. And a doctor was afraid that they were going to get in trouble, so they cut me off when I was deep into my addiction. And I was way beyond the power of choice at that point. And that story is not unique. 80% of heroin users in this country start on a prescription opioid, whether it's from, diversion or whether it's from a doctor, it's a prescribed opioid, and they end up on heroin. And the risk we run with the across-the-board limitations on prescriptions is you're not really doing much unless you offer people help. We know that just kicking people off of prescription drugs is not going to help solve the public health side. Do we need to be more conscious and limiting of opioid prescriptions in emergency room settings, in dental settings? Absolutely, 100%. But these across-the-board limitations, no, it's not working. We're seeing chronic pain patients who are suffering as a result of it too. We need to find a way where we can do this, where we're not harming chronic pain patients, where people aren't having to, result to suicide and heroin as alternatives.
When we look at it, a lot of people might say, well, I had a opioid prescription and I never got hooked on it. I took 4 or 5 pills, I did 10, what have you, and then I walked away from it. What is it that we should understand about the addiction to opioids? I recall that I was moderating a panel on this, and people who were in a very good treatment program here in Connecticut said that underlying this is a lot of emotional pain, the reason that people get addicted. Give me your take on this.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, usually addiction is precipitated by some sort of emotional pain and trauma. I certainly had mine in my childhood years, but that doesn't, that's not necessarily for 100% of people who come to experience opioids. Some of them, it is acquired as a result of being on a prescription too long. I mean, really, we are learning more and more about the brain science behind addiction, substance use disorders. I would tell you that, yes, at the root of addiction is trauma, is emotional pain. But look, I think you'd be hard, to find, a person in America who has not experienced some sort of emotional trauma or pain in their life, such as myself. So it was, what was there, that underlying factor? 100%. But did a doctor, for my first time going on opioids, do me any favors by writing me a very high-grade prescription for Dilaudid, which is, basically a very high milligram of Dilaudid, which is usually given in a hospital setting, and putting me on it for long term? That didn't help it at all. I mean, so I mean, yes, it's a combination of the two. But I think more important, we need to understand the signs and the symptoms of what a substance use disorder looks like. And we need more prescriber education, not just in terms of limiting people in terms of opioids, but knowing what that looks like. Making sure that right from the beginning, when people are in pediatrics that we're knowing if people are at high risk for addiction, that we are keeping an eye on them, that we are providing more evidence-based prevention, that we are providing more prescriber education. I can't tell you how many times I went into my primary care physician as a young man, as a teenager, and as a young adult in my 20s, and they had no information. They did not know what to do with me. They did not know, and that's wrong in the United States of America in 2019. Like, we know what the signs, we know what the symptoms are. We need to start requiring more prescriber education. Right now in the United States, addiction and substance use disorders, it is only a certification class in medical school. You go to Harvard Medical School, you only need to take a class that's less than 1 hour long in 4 years of medical school to learn about addiction. That is ludicrous.
And when we think about it, you had a story in your book about Mikey. Would you give us just a thumbnail of that? Because that might be instructive or illustrative of what you're talking about.
I mean, Mikey was, just as a FYI, Mikey's doing really well now. He's coming close to celebrating about 1.5 years in recovery. Mike is one of my best friends. We had gotten sober together about 1.5 years into his recovery, almost 2 years into his recovery. He had a relapse. He had gotten into a relationship, and they had a kid, and the relationship soured, and he ended up using heroin again. Really wanted help. Really, really wanted help badly. And was not able to find it. I had him stay on my couch and detox, and I kind of became his best advocate and pulled strings that I had to get him into treatment, to get him into recovery housing. Mikey didn't, he had a very basic 9-to-5 minimum wage job, didn't have good health insurance that would cover addiction treatment, certainly didn't have $30,000 banked away, neither did his parents to send him to treatment. And Mikey's story is just an example of how high the barrier is for people who want help to get help. Mikey couldn't just walk into an emergency room somewhere like you do if you've got a heart attack or a diabetic attack or, any other health disorder and get treated on demand. Mikey had to beg. Mikey had to beg for help, and he had to have friends beg for help, because unless he had that type of money, those doors to treatment were closed to him. And he was at a point where he needed medical assistance. Peer support is something that has saved his life and helped to lead him onto a continuum of recovery, and it's been very important to him. But at that moment of crisis, he needed real medical support. And without, a large sum of cash or a very good insurance, private payer organization PPO card, he wasn't getting it. And that is what's wrong in this country. There are 23 million people approximately right now who need help for addiction right now, most of them suffering in silence. And only 1 out of 10 of those, 10%, will ever be able to get treatment. Our treatment gap in this country is 90%. 90% of people who need help for a substance use disorder will never get help because the barriers to treatment are so high, and that has got to change.
As we look at this opioid crisis, some have compared it to the crack epidemic of a number of years ago, but said that because it's cratered the heartland communities in many ways, and we've seen reports of rural use of opioids, it has boosted some fatalities in urban neighborhoods, and it has invaded, quote-unquote, good suburban homes. What has that done to the political constituency to deal with this whole issue in more holistic terms?
You're absolutely right. I mean, until this issue hit, suburban America, politicians just didn't really care. It's also important to note, though, that communities of color are actually impacted at a higher rate in terms of overdose deaths and in terms of usage, even with opioids, than white communities. And we need to acknowledge that. When the opioid crisis became kind of national headlines and hit the scene media-wise, it was right at the beginning of the New Hampshire primary, 2015, late 2014, 2015. All the candidates for president of the United States had descended onto New Hampshire thinking they were going to talk about taxes and immigration and Social Security reform and all the normal talking points that they would go through. And they showed up at these community town halls, which is kind of what is nice about, having these early primary states. Showed up at these community town halls, and nobody wanted to talk about that. We had parents who got up and wanted to talk about their kids who were dead. and who had died of a heroin overdose or an opioid overdose that year. They wanted to educate these politicians on what was going on in their backyard. And as you know, New Hampshire has experienced the overdose crisis, tenfold of what many other states have. So they got hit really hard, and they're continuing to deal with that. So the narrative was really built in New Hampshire as a result of kind of it being first in the nation and having all this attention. Shortly after that, you saw President Obama mentioned it in his State of the Union address. These candidates went to other states as the primaries continued to roll, from east to west. And they realized that this wasn't a problem that was just going on there. It was happening in other states too. Now, we had the data to point to this for some time. We knew that the overdose crisis was on a rise, but it wasn't until voters stood up and started speaking their truth that politicians really cared. And that's why this issue started to really get pushed to the front of the headlines. But that's also why in the book, and my main call to action is civic participation by urban neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods, white, black, purple, red, blue states, whatever it may be. We have to continue talking about this. We need to get civically engaged. We need to be registering to vote. We need to be voting as a block. The more and more that policymakers as involved and engaged civic activists, the more solutions we'll get, the more funding we'll get, the more we'll get a public health approach. The more, I believe in that saying of no decisions about us without us. But we have to show them that we matter and we're not just this substandard group of people, which is kind of how we had been seen for quite some time. People who are suffering from addiction and people in recovery, there's been a very long history of societal shame and stigma that's been attached to that. And that narrative is being changed. Being changed as a result of brave people who are getting up and telling their stories, family members who are getting up and talking about the loss of a loved one, family members who are getting up and talking about their kids who are in recovery, people in recovery themselves standing up and saying, listen, we're here, we deserve to be counted, and you need to listen to us. Just as there are 23 million people who are suffering from addiction right now, there's another 23 million Americans who live in long-term recovery in the United States. That is a very large voting bloc, and I think.
And you've been involved in politics over the years, Ryan. You've been very successful, Of course, as an advocate with Facing Addiction, founder of the Voices Project. Are we going to sense the impact of this group of people, both those who've been affected directly and family members, in the upcoming 2020 election?
Absolutely, 100%. I will, leave you with this: that any candidate for president of the United States in 2020 that does not take on the opioid crisis, and more importantly than the opioid crisis, the addiction crisis in the United States as a top issue, and when I say top, like in the top 4 issues they're talking about, is going to have a very hard time getting out of their party's primary. This is an issue that is at the top of every American's mind. It is a healthcare issue. It is a civil justice issue. It is an economic issue. It is something that impacts 1 in 3 households in the United States. It has got to remain front and center, and it is a voting issue. So yes, this is something, and I've been tracking that. I have been tracking it. Many of the candidates have been talking about it in the context of their announcement speeches. We're seeing policy papers start to fly out of campaigns on this. It will remain front and center for the 2020 elections. Hopefully, we'll start to get some more public health solutions so that by the 2024 elections, it will no longer be a crisis. That is hopeful and wishful thinking. But if we are ever going to get to an end to this, we do need a lot of money, and we need it spent the right way, which means that policymakers, candidates need to keep it front and center. But in order for that to happen, we, the people, those who are affected, have to hold them accountable until that happens.
But you remind us that we have a deeply flawed system that criminalizes addiction, pushes Big Pharma's agenda, and doesn't educate people about recovery options. Do you see that beginning to turn around or no?
It absolutely is beginning to turn around. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book, one of the reasons I founded the Voices Project. Look, there's emerging, I just happened to write a book. I mean, there's people like me all over the country. There's an emerging movement of people who are deeply involved in this work, who are holding people accountable. I think just in the last 2 years, we have made tremendous strides in terms of criminal justice reform, even with a Republican president such as Donald Trump. The First Step Act, which was signed into law just a few weeks ago, is monumental. It is absolutely monumental in terms of starting to decriminalize some of these behaviors that have held people back for a long time. So yes, the pendulum is shifting.
All right. Well, Ryan Hampton, you've been so generous with your time today, and an incredible read. It really is. If you want to understand the issue in a more holistic and personal way, Ryan shares it all. American Fix: Inside the Opioid Addiction Crisis and How to End It. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you for having me on.
Hey, Larry.
Yeah. What's up,
I
John?
got some exciting news for you.
Well, let's hear it.
We're part of the MHNR network.
And where can we find that?
That's mhnrnetwork.com.
I'm going there right now.
All right.